It's the summer of 1999. In a bedroom in Pinecrest, Florida, a 15-year-old sits in front of a computer late into the night. He calls himself C0 Marade. He is not old enough to drive. Within a few months, he will have broken into the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, a division of the U.S. Department of Defense, and stolen software from NASA worth an estimated $1.7 million. This is the story of the first minor ever incarcerated for cybercrime in the United States. Jonathan James grew up in a middle-class suburb outside Miami. He wasn't a troublemaker, he wasn't a loner, he was, by every account from people who knew him, quiet, sharp, and bored. School didn't challenge him, computers did. He taught himself to code before most kids his age had a home computer at all. By his early teens, he had moved past programming into something else entirely, breaking into systems that weren't his to enter. Not for money, not at first for any clear reason at all, for the challenge of it. In June 1999, James targeted the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, the Pentagon's arm responsible for reducing threats from nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. He installed a backdoor into the agency's servers. It let him intercept more than 3,000 internal messages. Some of those messages contained employee usernames and passwords. Some discussed sensitive military operations. He wasn't inside for hours. He was inside for weeks. Nobody noticed. From there, James moved deeper. He accessed a computer at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. Inside, he found the source code for the International Space Station's life support systems. This wasn't decorative software. It controlled the physical environment astronauts would breathe, live, and work inside once the station was operational. James downloaded it. NASA later estimated the software was worth $1.7 million to replace and secure. When investigators eventually traced the intrusion, NASA made a decision that still gets debated in cybersecurity circles today. Rather than risk that a compromised system might still be exposed, they shut down their networks entirely for 3 weeks. The cost of the shutdown alone ran into tens of thousands of dollars, separate from the value of the stolen code itself. A 15-year-old, working alone from a suburban bedroom, had forced a shutdown at one of the most sophisticated technical organizations on the planet. How does a teenager get this far into military and space infrastructure without instantly triggering alarms? The answer is less about James's individual brilliance and more about how unprepared the systems were. Government cybersecurity in the late 1990s was young. Password policies were weak. Patches for known vulnerabilities went uninstalled for months. Networks that should have been isolated from each other weren't. James didn't need a sophisticated custom exploit. He needed patience, curiosity, and time, and he had all three in abundance. He wasn't acting alone in spirit, even if he worked alone at the keyboard. James was part of a loose online culture of young hackers who traded techniques, bragged in private chat rooms, and treated breaking into secure systems as a kind of underground sport. Some of them wanted to make a political point, some wanted money. James, by most accounts, wanted to prove he could. The break came through old-fashioned investigative work rather than a digital trail. Federal investigators had already been building a case against a hacking ring, and James's activity surfaced in the course of that broader inquiry. In January 2000, agents from NASA and the Department of Defense conducted a joint raid on the James family home. He was 15 years old when federal agents searched his bedroom. Because he was a minor, the case moved through a different system than an adult offender would have faced. In 2000, James pleaded guilty to charges related to the intrusions. He was sentenced to 6 months of detention at a juvenile facility in Alabama, followed by probation until his 18th birthday. He was also barred from using a computer recreationally during that period, a restriction that, for a kid who had built his entire identity around what a keyboard let him do, amounted to a kind of exile. At the time, prosecutors were candid about their reasoning. James was young, he hadn't sold what he'd taken, he hadn't caused physical harm, but he had proven undeniably that critical US infrastructure could be breached by someone with no formal training, no state backing, and no adult supervision. That fact mattered more to the government than James's age did. He became, officially, the first juvenile ever incarcerated in the United States for a cybercrime. After his release, James tried to move forward. He gave interviews. He spoke with some caution about wanting to work in computer security professionally, turning the skill that had gotten him arrested into a legitimate career, the same path many hackers of his generation eventually took. Some of his peers from that era went on to work for the same kinds of agencies they'd once broken into. James, for a while, seemed to be heading that direction too. Then, in 2007, his name resurfaced. A massive breach hit TJX Companies, the parent corporation of retailers, including TJ Maxx and Marshalls. Investigators eventually linked the intrusion to a hacking ring responsible for stealing tens of millions of credit and debit card numbers, one of the largest data breaches in American history at the time. Federal agents suspected James might have been involved and searched his home again. James denied any connection to the TJX breach. He maintained that he had left hacking behind after his 2000 conviction. No formal charges were ever filed against him in relation to the case. But something had changed. Friends and family later described James as increasingly convinced that the government intended to prosecute him regardless of the truth, that his history as the first ever juvenile cybercrime conviction made him a permanent target, someone who would be blamed the moment any major breach needed a name attached to it. On May 18, 2008, Jonathan James was found dead in his home in Pinecrest, Florida. He was 24 years old. The death was ruled a suicide by gunshot. He left behind a note. In it, he wrote that he had no faith in the justice system and that a prosecution, deserved or not, was, in his mind, inevitable. He said he believed his death might be blamed on the same government agencies he felt were pursuing him. No charges were ever brought against James in the TJX case, before or after his death. The investigation into that breach concluded with other individuals convicted, and James's specific role, if any, was never established in court. What remains is a case that never fully closed, a federal shutdown of NASA's networks that a teenager caused almost by accident, a conviction that made legal history, and a death that left more questions unanswered than it settled about what he did, what he didn't do, and what exactly he believed was coming for him.